I'm willing to trade off for my last slide on more time to discuss it. So my last topic is based on the communication. So I can send you a few more slides. More considerations, more units.
Just put them into this slide submission.
Okay.
You will regenerate.
Absolutely. I'll look into it right away. Where we now agree. Okay, I can send you. Oh, unless my PowerPoint crashes, I'm not sure. Start doing it before.
This is a major change. And it's not over with the Ericsson.
Yeah.
Good morning. So people are slowly arriving, either because they had to sleep after the social or because they have been to 2 side meetings already this morning, as most people have been. This is the core group. I'm Carsten Bormann, this is Jaime Jimenez. And as you can see, we have streamlined this a little bit. So you know only can be a chair of this working group if you have a 12-character email address. So Jaime had to change his. Yeah, it turns out that Ericsson has standardized on Outlook, and I'm not going to explain further from this point. Yeah, this is an IETF meeting, and there is a Node well slide, which you can look at. And we have blue sheets. Who are the note takers today? Niklas, so you're using the Etherpad? Great. Let's hope that actually works. There were some interesting messages from the Secretariat about the Etherpad yesterday. Who can help, Niklas? Ivaldo will. Okay, great. So the agenda has a lot of items and some pretty random assumption how long we will take for these items. So we will see where we maybe can gain some time and where we will lose time. So this is the agenda for today, which is essentially based around 3 subjects. The CoreConf work, where we essentially need to issue working group last calls at the moment and should just ask whether there's anything in the way. The various ideas on how to use the group communication and properties that we now can achieve with OSCORE. So we have 4 segments here. And finally, we will talk about SendML, and because there is one document in the ISG processing right now that we want to get unstuck, something might fall off here at the end. Let's see how we manage to do this, because on Friday we actually have some buffer space that we can fall into. So things we don't get to today will move to Friday. And the main subject of Friday will be discussing the outcome of yesterday's core application site meeting and the related drafts. But of course, we will need that buffer to handle everything that falls off today. So two things are missing here. One is the resource directory draft, which is also in ISG processing right now, or actually in AD evaluation right now. That might also come up on Friday. And there's also a draft that expired and we want to resurrect. And while we were trying to resurrect it, we found a minor problem with the ABNF that actually is not that easy to fix. Maybe we can bring this up on Friday as well. So that's potential changes to the agenda that will hit Friday. Any other things that need to be changed on the agenda? Okay. So we had our hallway discussion already. That was yesterday in room Butterworth in the afternoon. I understand that some people couldn't go there because SEC dispatch was conflicting with it. Yeah, it's hard to organize site meetings here, but we had some good discussions, and I think Klaus will report on those on Friday. We have a number of documents in the pipeline. The multi-part content format is in the RFC editor's queue, and because cluster 328 has been released, it will take a while until it emerges again. So I don't have a prediction for that, but it will take a while. Several documents are in ISG processing, and I'm a bit confused about the status of hop limit. It has this wonderful text: approved announcement to resend point raised write up needed.
Yeah, sorry, I should have. I need to follow up on this. Can you have a read of Adam's comments section asking why this cannot be mapped to HTTP header field? Seems quite straightforward. I would like people to have a look at this and quickly tell me why it's not possible.
Right. So just to decode what you just said.
Yeah.
We have a new hop limit option which can mitigate cycles on the co-op side. And the question is, why are we unable to do the same thing on the HTTP
well,
side?
there is some text about mapping to HTTP and then saying, but this still cannot be preserved end to end. So why don't you define a new HTTP header? I think that's the gist of Adam's comment.
Right. Okay. I think we can answer that. So this is the point raised.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry for not being clear. Yes, that's the only thing that, as far as I'm concerned, that sort of made me pause to push the approve button.
Okay. So I think we had this discussion already a couple of months ago, and the result of that discussion, and I'm not sure if Adam is part of the consensus of that, was that we had a solution now for the co-op side. And we're happy with that because that's solving the problem that DOTS has, and doing something that actually spans both sides is more complex.
Okay. I think his comment is along the lines that it's not hard to define a HTTP header field for this.
Right.
To just preserve it.
Yeah. So we already had a proposal at one point to define a generic HTTP header. Here is a co-op option. Please transport that for me. We almost had that in OSCORE. It turned out we didn't need it in OSCORE.
Right.
In the end, but we could resurrect that, so we don't have to go through this for every new thing.
That's certainly a generic way of addressing this comment. Yes, that would be. Yes.
Okay, good. So I know what to do there.
But yeah, one that shouldn't be difficult to get closure on, I would think.
Thanks. So the resource directory work is just in the phase where Alexei is making a number of comments and the authors are working on those comments. That is all mirrored to the core mailing list, so you should be able to follow that discussion. And if you think that discussion is going in the wrong direction, then it would be really useful if you speak up. But it's not clear right now that we actually need to talk here about that. And if we do, we will do it on Friday. Then we have 2 drafts that are in the CNML cluster. So we will talk about those today. One is the fetch patch draft. How do you use CNML media types together with fetch and patch methods? And one is about the more units proposal for CNML. I think we have some progress there, and we'll talk about that later. We have a couple of drafts that are still in the working group last call. Still in the working group, they have passed last call. One is the stateless draft where Klaus, where's Klaus, by the way? Can someone wake him up? Where Klaus hasn't provided the update to the draft after the working group last call input. Yeah, he missed the deadline, and we are waiting for -04. And request tag actually made the deadline, and we now just need the Shepherd write-up and push it through. So these are the advanced documents. The one draft I talked about that has an ABNF problem will be resurrected, and when we are done with the ABNF problem, we are probably ready for working group last call. There's a draft missing there. Sorry, I'm making the same mistake again. In working group adoption call is the phaser draft. Sorry for not putting it on this slide. We put that out yesterday belatedly, and I have to apologize for that. And we also have the corrections clarifications draft that went through a working group adoption call but didn't get much feedback, even though people in the room said this might be a good idea. So maybe we have to reconsider that, how we go forward with this. Do you have any other document you're worried about at the moment and that is not already on the agenda? Okay, then we can go into the main part of the agenda.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Ivail Petrov, and I will be presenting the advancements in CoreConf. So basically, not much has changed since the last IETF. The documents are pretty stable. For the seed draft, there are no updates. What we did was, as it was requested at the last IETF, we merged the seed generation 2 with the Yank 2. Otherwise, we didn't receive any new comments, and I think it's good for a working group last call. I guess at the end we will discuss all of them. Okay. So yes, that's the status of this document. For the Young Seaboard document, we updated it, I think, in September. There are a few changes that are worth mentioning, like there was a conflict with the Seaboard tag that we were made aware of. After some discussion, we agreed to change the Seaboard tag that we were using, and we went ahead and made this modification in version 11. The other more significant change is that a should was changed to a must in section 5 related to young data template encoding. It was clear that the intent was to be a must for us, but we just had made this mistake. Otherwise, a number of editorial changes. We clarified how deltas are used exactly. We referred to RFC 8610 for CBOR diagnostic notation, and we updated the terminology section. We removed the plus sign from the examples. Added some previously missing examples, for example, related to leaf encoding with names or any XML, and we updated the examples not to point to obsolete RFCs, but those are very minor editorial changes. Nothing significant was changed here. We believe still that the document is much easier to, it's more consistent now. So we also believe that it's ready for a working group last call. The next document, it was drafted by IETF Young Library, which was adopted during the last IETF. So it was resubmitted as draft IETF Core Young Library -00. We didn't receive any new comments from the last version, so there are no changes to this document. All the comments that were submitted before were already applied to -05. And yes, if there are no concerns about this document, we feel that we can go to working group last call. And finally, for the COMI document, what changed from version 07 to version 08 is that we now also reference OSCORE as a possible security mechanism. We also changed a should to a must when talking about user-ordered lists in the netconf document. It's very clear that those lists must be ordered as they are provided, and we had put a should before, which we realized and we fixed it. So those are the more important changes that we did. Other than that, we clarified in section 4.3.2 how that we should add the keys when we add a new element to a list. We updated the reference to Core Young Library as it has a new draft name. We added IETF copyright to a Young description, so very minor changes already. And at a few places we had forgotten to change the name COMI to CoreConf, and we fixed that. Another minor change was that at some places we were giving the recommended value /C instead of saying that it's a generic thing that users can change, which we believe was clear, but it could have been a little bit confusing for some people. So now we use the more generic form. And we removed the plus signs from examples as it was discussed during the last IETF. So there are no other changes that we are aware as needed, and we think we are ready for working group last call. Are there any comments or any concerns so far?
Rob Wilson, Cisco. So my question actually is back on the SIDS draft.
Yes.
I've made a comment, I think, on the ALIS before. I can't see whether it's in the latest document. That draft's defining the SIDS as unsigned 64-bit integers.
Mhm.
But if they're being put in as deltas in the files, if that's still being done in the actual messages, I think you want this to be unsigned 63-bit integers, so that when you subtract them, you still end up within a signed 64-bit integer value.
Okay.
So you just want to, in terms of what you allocate, I think you want to allocate only 63 bits rather than 64.
Mhm. Okay.
So I think that's been discussed on the ALIS, so hopefully that
Yeah,
goes in.
I remember that it was discussed in the mailing list at some point. Okay. Sorry about this omission. We will take it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Rob Wilson.
Any other comments?
Okay, so I think this was the state that we were trying to achieve here. We have, you didn't say much about it, but you mentioned PYANG. There are implementations out there. A number of people have looked at this, so it generally looks okay. So this is working group plus core material. And I think the important thing about that working class call is that it actually will include the netmod and netconf working groups. So we will send out a working class call to the 3 groups with a request to actually have the discussion on the core mailing list. But I think it's important that these other groups are actually a part of this working group plus core.
Yes.
Okay. So if everybody agrees about that, maybe a quick poll. Who cares about Yang? 4 people. 4 people in this room. I know that there are other people who are not in this room. I don't know. Maybe we have a conflict with some management group. I don't know. Didn't check. Okay. So I think we will go ahead. Thank you.
Okay.
Oscar Groupcom.
Hi. Hi, this is Marco Tiloca from RISE for the next 4 presentations. First one, Group of SCORE, yet another advanced update. This was mostly related to addressing the comments we got from Ludwig's review. Thanks a lot for that. And a quick overview of those. We clarified that the group ID now must be unique for the set of groups under the same group manager, which is also directly and clearly responsible for validating the public keys used in the group, since from the joining as to their format, related parameters, encoding, and so on. There's also a part of the secure co-op message processing that was moved away from this document to the update of 7390 that we are doing with ESCO. And this is about ensuring that a client receives up to 1 response per server per request, with the exception of observe. It used to be defined here, according to previous discussion, moved away to that other document. Also, we improved the encoding of the 2 external ADs defined here, according to previous discussion and results from interops. And we decided to totally decouple and make related to application-specific policies the way a recipient node handles with the derivation of a recipient context in case it is still missing, or the retrieval of the necessary public keys to process that message. So that doesn't have to happen necessarily the first time a message is received from a yet unknown sender. It could have happened before, and it's totally up to application policies. Also, we made a number of clarifications on the group rekeying and cases where a recipient node may be interested at its own risk to some extent to keep for a short while an old recipient context. So to give some time to have the key rollover completed and the group stable in this respect. So what's ongoing? A few things. We still would appreciate to get feedback on what we should actually mandate to implement as a preferred context ensure algorithm. Right now it's EDDSA with a 25519 curve. This is just about feedback from vendors and use case deployers and so on. It is still an open question. Then one particular point from Jim, very latest comments that we discussed last week. Thanks for that. There is a corner case related to the case where recipient node can keep for a while the old previous recipient context and key material, where a request is essentially protected with the old key material, and when the recipient receives it, well, it's still in a position to decrypt it, but it also has the new context ready to go, and it should use the latest context to protect the response. But just to give a confirmation to the client that then they are aligned again, we are going to include the group ID as ID context in the response in this first response to the client. And at the very least, in this first following notification in case of service use. So we plan to include this node also in the next update. Also, right now, we are still defining two new IANA registers in this document for indicating the structure to follow when indicating parameters for the use context ensure algorithm and keys. We are going to remove these registries from here because we are instead going to point at extended IANA registries that Jim has defined in the update to COSI as useful for GroupoScore and for other works, for instance, to EDOC. So as immediate next steps, we plan to integrate the totally non-critical comments we got from Jim last week and discussed with him already, and it's relatively easy to incorporate them and remove also the IANA registries I've just mentioned. But considering the very advanced status of the document that got many reviews so far and this relatively easy comments from Jim that we know already how to address, and the many interops we've gone through, we think this can actually be considered to move on to working group call now.
So, of course, the usual questions. So who has read this version of the document? Well, maybe a little bit too little time since the deadline. Who has read a version of this document? Ludwig. Great, thank you. Yeah, I agree with that. And two hands in Jabber. Okay, so it would be nice if the people who previously supplied reviews would send a quick notice to the mailing list. Yes, this is working group last call ready. I mean, we're still going to have a working group last call there, but it would be nice to hear from the reviewers that they think their comments have been addressed. So that would be my proposal for proceeding here. So which normative references do you have? Which of the other things need to be done before this can become RFC?
From the Jabber, Jim, do you want this now or after the next version? I guess like the this is a mail saying, yes, I think this is ready for working group last call.
After the next version?
Okay.
Both is useful. Thank you.
I can think of 7390 bis as normative reference
Yes.
that we have here that is not adopted yet. More on this later. Nothing else that I can remember, actually. I'll double check, but that's probably the elephant in the room.
Okay. So I think we need to discuss how these drafts can move without ending up in a giant cluster that is stuck on something.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Next then, this is another supportive document in a sense, so non-normative, as we presented before, of course. And just to recap, this is about assisting just deployed device that need to find out how to join groups they are interested in. They have essentially no idea what the group manager responsible for the group is, how to approach it, and the address to the join resource to talk to in order to join the group, and so on. And there's even the corner case where the device is deployed even before the group manager or before the group manager has set the group. And the device is there in a position where it needs to find out how to join the group and information to join it. For this, we are proposing to use the core resource directory, in the sense that the group manager essentially registers at the resource directory the links to its own join resources that the device has to talk to in order to join the group, and properties of the group configuration, aspects of the groups can be also included in the link description as target attributes, essentially. Then devices perform resource lookups on the resource directory, essentially to retrieve that link pointed to the group manager and the join resource. This was also recently discussed in one of the latest core interim, and a few people were asking for having widely shared a diagram along these lines where the whole lifecycle flow was shown. And this document is in fact on the very first step, where the client discovers essentially a link to the join resource at the group manager, and then things move on the ACE domain when you get authorized to in fact join the group through the join resource, or now group membership resource at the group manager, and then back to core when after having joined the group, you can use GrouposCore to communicate inside the group. So suggestions are welcome on the best way to make this diagram circulate and where to include a wiki, a separate document, whatever. But of course, this document is covering step 1.
Well, except for the color, we can now put it in an RFC as well.
Not yet. I know things are changing. But right, except for the colors. Okay, selected updates. This went through, in a sense, a kind of review or scrutiny again during a design workshop we had in Stockholm in October, and then was rediscussed the very same day, a few hours later, at the core interim we had. We clarified already in the abstract and most extensively in the introduction the rationale we have been building this approach on. The problem for a device is discovering the groups to join and properties of the groups and how to join them. And we are mapping this to the problem of discovering links that grant access to the group. So the problem becomes discovering the links and their descriptions, and it happens that there is an approach for doing that in core, which is the resource directory. So let's just use it in order to find out the links to join the group. In a sense, editorially, we renamed join resource to be called group membership resource, consistently with the works in ACE, because this is not about joining anymore. It also has meaning for the nodes that are already members in the group later on and can interact with the group manager as current members. Like done in the ACE document, we redefined the SecGP parameter to be simply an invariant plain name of the OSCORE group that is not related anymore at all with the actual OSCORE group ID, or as we were doing before, a zeroed epoch OSCORE group ID. So it's just much easier to handle, and it's just a plain identifier of the OSCORE group. We made also a minor change in how values are defined for the target attributes describing properties of the group, and in particular the signature algorithms and related parameters. We were before considering taking value from the name column of the corresponding COSI registries. We switched to the value column because the definition of those registries say that value in the value column must be unique rather than should. So it just seemed to be a better choice. Consistently with all these updates, we also updated the examples that I remember include also a real-world step-by-step Lightweight installation provided and supported by BACnet. Two open points that I can mention. The first one is actually moving forward. That was discussed before. We have a number of target attributes here. It would be good to register them. True, there's currently no registry for target attributes. As I said, this is moving forward, and apparently there is going to be at some point a work in progress document not published yet called core attributes, tentatively, which is also going to cover the creation of such a registry. So when that happens, there will be the opportunity also to register these target attributes. Speaking,
maybe you should add that this hasn't happened already in 2012 because at the time the document we were depending on said there is no such registry, and now the update RFC 8288 actually says if a serialization of web links wants to define such a registry, it can go ahead and do so. And so we can go ahead and do so, and it probably should. And so it's just that somebody has to do the work and that somebody has to hatch that egg.
Right, and that has started, in fact. And speaking of target attributes, we have postponed this for a while, but we have been thinking of, in fact, adding one more target attribute in the link description, specifying the URI of the authorization server that is supposed later on in the ACE phase of the full life cycle of the device to provide an access token to grant access to the join resource at the group manager to proceed with the joining. This, of course, will spare the client to continue anyway, experiencing an unauthorized access out of which you get that URI anyway, eventually, from the group manager. So it's a matter of optimization. And we don't see any particular problem in including also this link as further target attribute. So unless there are strong objections against that, we plan to do that in the next update. And seems there are not.
Well, Klaus isn't here yet.
Right.
If I may play Klaus for a second, he might tell you that URIs are the things that links point to and not necessarily target attributes. But I can't emulate Klaus beyond that, so I can't say how he might propose a design for that.
I will check also with Klaus. Thanks. Okay, yeah, to summarize, most of the updates were clarifying the rationale of this approach in introduction mostly, and encoding of target attributes, and this new additional one we can include, updating the examples accordingly. We think the document is already in a pretty good shape actually to move forward, and it went through, I would say, a review process during that design workshop we had in Stockholm, and again during the following interim. Still, we would also like to get review on the actual document, as promised 2 meetings ago, with a few volunteers. So yeah, we solicit again reviews on the actual document in order to process them.
Okay, so the way forward is that you will nag the people who promised reviews and...
I do now. That's the list again, just as a reminder with minutes linked. Yeah, thank you. Okay, next then, this work was also presented for the first time at the last meeting in Montreal. We are defining multicast responses as observed notifications. And just as a recap, this is in general useful the moment you have multiple clients all observing a same resource on the server, that rather than replying with many individual responses to each of those clients, would instead send a single multicast notification. And the very practical use case we consider as reference use case from the beginning is PubSub, where then you have a number of subscribers all interested in observing a same request on the broker server. And other than the performance benefit of multicast, here you'd be able then to keep those subscribers as pure clients only. So of course, multicast responses are not defined now. You can imagine why. It's mostly because of problems related to the binding of token values between requests and responses, not to mention security. And this document is exactly about filling this gap and described how these multicast responses can work. The approach we had in the previous version was pretty much redesigned, more on that later, but to answer one of the most critical questions from the previous meeting on the handling on the token space, we ended to something like this. The token space formally belongs to the group of observers, but then practically the group is entrusting the practical management of that space to the server. Bottom line, the result is that all clients will be aligned to a very same token value that will appear over and over in all notifications for the same group observation. And like before, it is possible to have security using GroupoScore to protect all those multicast notifications. And when that's the case, the clients will be synchronized in using all the same external AAD for, well, protecting and verifying those multicast responses. This is at a high level. A number of assumptions. The clients have already discovered the exact resource they want to observe on the server, and the server knows already the multicast IP address and port where to send multicast notifications to. If GroupoScore is used to protect the notifications, at least the server must be already in the right OSCORE group. Not necessarily the client from the beginning, but there's a way I can show you so that the server can help the clients to understand on the run what's the right OSCORE group to consider. So this new design came up out of the many feedback we got in Montreal, and then was extensively discussed during a meeting we had, a design workshop actually we had in Stockholm in October, and then summarized also at the core interim. We concluded that it's the server that can practically start the group observation on behalf of the group at any point in time, but practically in case one of these two things happen, first, there's no observers yet on that resource. A first client comes and the server decides right away then to start the group observation. Or there are already a number of clients observing that resource in a traditional way, and the server decides, no, wait, it's just better that they all switch as observers participating in a group observation. But how does the server practically start this group observation? It has to do that like on behalf of the group. And to that end, the server generates what we call a phantom observation request. So it's an observation request for registration that the server generates itself and sends to itself without hitting the wire, of course. It's like if it is sent by the group, so like from the multicast IP address, that of course cannot really happen on the network, but that's just to give you the intuition. And all the following multicast responses as notifications will be in fact sent to that multicast IP address, and they will be in fact a response to that phantom request, not really to any individual registration request sent by the client. So practically, if the server decides to start a group observation, it builds this phantom request, sends it to itself, and when building it, it has to choose a token value. Well, it chooses it from a token space that practically the server manages, and this token space is related to messages that are like coming from the multicast IP address of the group and addressed to that target resource. So the server has all the ability to keep the uniqueness of the on-use token values from that space. The server processes this phantom request like if coming from the group, from the multicast IP address. And from then on, that token value T the server chose is the one used for the group observation, practically in responses. The phantom request is stored, and there doesn't have to be a response right away, a notification right away. That can just happen when the resource value, in fact, changes. But what about the clients? The server has to tell the client that this is happening as a new client comes, or in case clients already observing in a traditional way are switched to the group observation. In either case, the server sends to the client an error response that includes some information, and in particular the IP multicast address and port where the notifications will be sent, a serialization of the phantom request from which the client can take all the detailed information they need, and a current representation of the target resource, because clients were interested in knowing that value already in the first place, and it's a bit unfair to push them to send yet another request. We can include the current value right there already. Then later on, of course, when the value of the resource changes, the server can send multicast notifications to that IP multicast address with the token value it's selected for the phantom request. And in fact, the multicast notifications will be a response to the phantom request. But when getting an error response of this kind, the client will essentially start or configure on its side an observation for that resource on its own client endpoint associated to that multicast IP address, and will accept notification addressed to that multicast address with that token value T that the client retrieved from the serialized phantom request delivered in the error response. As an example, here we have a server that has no observers at all at the beginning on this resource /r. And the first client one sends a traditional observation request, and the server decides right away, no, we'll go for a group observation here with this first client participating in it. So the server decides to allocate the token value FF, creates a phantom request, essentially the message within the green box, says that token value is selected, send it to himself in a way like if coming from the multicast address, and then replies to the client with an error message. We went for the error code 503. That seemed the most appropriate to consider here. And the payload of this error message, as I said, includes the multicast address to be considered for notifications, the serialization of the whole phantom request, and the current resource value. And, well, something identical happens when a next client C2 comes, other than, well, there's no need anymore for yet another phantom request. The observation is ongoing already. But the response to the client is exactly the same as for the other one. But eventually, the value of the resource changes, and then it's when the server can finally send a multicast notification to the group addressed to that multicast address and with the token value chosen for this group observation. So the binding here at the co-op level is between the multicast notifications and the phantom request with that token value. If you want to add security on this, well, it's essentially about protecting the phantom request with group OSCORE in the first place. And the server at least has to be from the very beginning a member of the OSCORE group, so it's in a position to do that. This phantom request will then have an OSCORE option, of course, which will include the sender ID of the server and the consumed sequence number value of that sender, let's say as X and Y. The point here is that then every single following multicast notification will be protecting using as external AAD a structure including X and Y as REC-KID and REC-PAV, which is consistent. They are the ones from the phantom request, in fact. And since this phantom request protected with group OSCORE will be still included in the error response to the clients, they'll be able to retrieve this information too and to build correctly that external AAD for every single multicast notification coming later on. So here you have a secure tie between, again, the notifications and the phantom request based also on group OSCORE. Optionally, there's the possibility for the server to give some more information in that error response if you do so, some of that information must be included then. And we are thinking of the URI of the joint resource of the group manager to join the group, and the name as plain identifier of the total score group. You can possibly add more information on the way the group works, essentially, algorithms, parameters, and so on. So that puts immediately the client in a position to know what to do, where to go in order to join the group. But this is optional, and the client can rely instead on other means like the draft I have just presented before based on the resource directory discovery. Well, in case you consider group score is just the same. It's just that the phantom request is also a group score protected message, not the score option with KD5 and partial V501. So after that, the sequence number of the server is stepped forward, of course, to 502. The error response includes also the phantom request as a group score message serialized, and more information on this error response, how to join the group, essentially, the link to the join resource and the name of the group. Same thing for the second client, of course, with no need for yet another phantom request. Finally, when it's about sending the multicast notification, this is, of course, also protected with group score, the score option, as this time a partial AV502, the latest sequence number to be consumed. But the point is, this notification is protecting using as external AD, REC ID 5, but REC IV 501. So to ensure the secure binding with the original phantom request. So to conclude, this is the result of, I would say, major revision from version 0 based on the feedback, the discussion on the redesign workshop. The server is entrusted by the group to manage the token space consistently. We can enforce also secure binding between the notifications and the phantom request. And all in all, this is about performance. It's particularly useful in the pub/sub case, also to keep subscribers as client only. And now I think having reviews of the document as such, and this approach will be very useful to us. Unless there are comments already. You had many questions yourself, Karsten, at the previous meeting. I hope we are on a better track now.
Yeah, I think that this is pretty clever stuff. Of course, immediately questions like, how do you do congestion control come to mind whenever you are using multicast and so on. So I think this has still some way to go before we can say, okay, this is acceptable. But at least to me, it seems to be the best proposal we have had in this space so far. Don't know if other people have an opinion on this.
Christian from the Jabber. Not on Karsten's point, but more general comment. One more new feature of the current revision is that the new error response, unlike the previous options, can be cached and distributed, possibly by a pub/sub server.
Interesting.
And a detail I forgot, compared to the original approach, this is much simpler because we don't need new co-op options anymore. We don't need to reserve any token range anymore.
Right. So I think the next step again is finding reviewers. So who is interested in reviewing this document? Doesn't look good. Yeah, we cannot make any progress without reviewers, obviously. Okay. Oh, one hand from the Jim.
Plan to do a read on it?
Who?
Jim.
Jim. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay, but that's not enough to really make progress on this as a working group. Yeah, we will have to find people who actually want to work on this.
Someone from the pub/sub space would be useful.
Yes. Okay, so I think that will happen on the mailing list.
Yes.
So I think you are up next.
Yes, and last. Right. Last for me today, at least. This is a work led by ESCO that handed me the presentation today. And it's an update, or actually an attempt to obsolete, if approved, 7390 that was defining group communication for co-op, in fact, over IP multicast. And this is going to be, a normative reference to group of score. Speaking of which, we have improved the nature of update or obsolescence of 7390. We clarified in the document in this version that we are essentially replacing everything of 7390 other than the experimental RESTful protocol that was defined there as an API for configuring groups, and that part remains there, experimental, essentially. And it happens it hasn't been used that much. So that's not covered by this document itself. Other than that, in this update, we clarified what's in scope for this document, and especially the security part and the definition of group of score as the must way to secure group communication for co-op. And we clarified also that all the main body of the document has to be considered normative, while everything in appendix, meaning use cases, are purely informational. You have a comment, Carsten?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about this obsolete except for the experimental protocol. So experiments, of course, can run forever, but then you never get a conclusion. So normally we try to have a point somewhere where we say, okay, this experiment was successful, this experiment was not so successful. And to me, it seems this experiment was not so successful.
That particular part, that interface, is apparently not used, or we couldn't find any use of it. Right. But anything else, group co-op was implemented.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about the part that you have in your except for. And I would imagine that at this point, we would say this experiment has concluded, and nothing came out of it. I mean, we're not going to do a replacement for this protocol in some form or anything. It's just an experiment that is concluded. So to me, it seems we actually can obsolete 7390 and be done with it.
Altogether.
I mean, if people want to read up on the experiment, the ROC is still there.
Sure.
But I think we are not continuing this particular experiment. At least I haven't heard from anyone who would want to. So I think we can simplify this a little bit and just say, okay, the new thing would just be a replacement for 7390.
So just removing the statements on the exception.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So what happened from last time? Well, we mostly processed the many comments from the reviews from Jim and Thomas Fossati. Thanks a lot for that. We reconsider all the content from 7390 in this new light. We had a number of TBD items left, especially in the final parts of the document describing how multicast can practically work in different multicast transport or internet working among different protocols and so on. We had a huge number of issues on the GitLab that we opened on the way. They were all closed, so the two or three ones you find now came up actually after the resubmission, but it's minor things. So we substantially concluded the document that is fully readable. On the new content we provide, we clarified a bit better how co-op works in detail with such model with respect to request-response interaction. We gave indication on meaningful good ways the server can consider for possible response suppression, and then it is recommended that it in fact supports the no response option, just as long as this improved the suppression policies in the interest of the client. We discuss what happens, the pros and cons of a client repeating multicast request with the same token, either changing or not changing the value of the message instead. So that can be useful for being sure that all of the servers that are reachable are on the same page with the client, of course, it has some impact on performance, or it can really do nothing much, or responses that are lost altogether. And as I mentioned in the group PostScore presentation, we moved in this document handling on the client side on responses from the server, so that with the exception of observe, the client is expected to have at most one response per server for a given request. We expanded on the security considerations and made a number of editorial improvements as well. We focused a bit more on observe, clarifying in what sense this draft is updating 7641 that doesn't really saying anything on observation requests sent of a multicast. We describe more in detail what happens when the client retransmits an observation request with the same token, and again, same or different message ID. And we gave some indications on what a server is supposed to do to check the liveliness of observing clients. And practically, we expect application policies along the lines. Every now and then, the server should send a confirmable observe notification. They should be non-confirmable, like the request, but it's in practice possible to have the confirmable, and that should happen here and there for the sake of liveliness check. On possibly updating blockwise instead, we took a step back, and we are not really updating it anymore. We are expanding a bit more, especially on the block 2 usage, but all in all along the line of 7959. But we are just adding considerations on the fact that block 1 would be really problematic in a multicast context. So we are highlighting the problems, but we are not really proposing how to solve them. Seems like a bit exaggerated and out of scope for this draft. Possibly, if there is enough interest, that can be a topic for a totally separate document. So because of this, essentially, we are not really updating 7959 anymore as there was intended originally. But this can be rediscussed possibly if more input come. So what we expect next? I mentioned a few minor issues we find already tracked on GitHub, but they are minors. We had after a submission more comments from Jim Schell stating this is all in all a good document, but proposing a number of minor fixes and additions here and there. And Thomas already promised another review on this latest version, hopefully soon. Then, of course, it would be interesting to start considering one of those implementations supporting co-op over multicast. I can immediately think of Californium, of course. And, well, co-op multicast itself just works. We used it for group PostScore interop. It would be interesting to test over this also additional co-op services and especially observe. All in all, considering the current status, these minor next steps we already see in front of us and the many reviews we got, we think this is for sure eligible to consider for working group adoption.
Okay, so the usual question, who has read a version of this document? 2 hands. Any hands from Jabber? No hands from Jabber. So when we did 1 hand from Jabber. So when we did 7390, we knew that this was an interim placeholder, and we were 2 hands from Jabber. This was going to be a placeholder for a while until we understood the issues better. So this, to a certain extent, always has been on the agenda to revisit at some point, and I'm happy that this is actually happening now. It's the only experimental protocol that only experimental RFC that we have produced here, if I remember correctly, and it would be nice to get this weak spot repaired. But of course, we can only do this if we get the reviews for is already not that bad. So that makes me partially happy. Francesca.
Francesca Palombini. Yeah, I just want to say I support adoption of this as quickly as possible and move it forward. Also considering like the normative reference from Group OSCORE, which is an adopted document, is moving forward.
Yes.
Assuming adoption of this, of course, I'm pretty confident the next version, at least we'll do our best, maybe even considerable for a quick shift to working group plus code, if that can help.
So you talked about implementation in California. How far away is that?
Group co-op is already there and working well.
Yeah,
we use.
But if you take the whole draft, how much of that is actually implemented?
According to Akim Kraus, I can get back to an old mail he posted to Core, actually. He was saying that was aligned to 7390.
Okay.
In fact.
Yeah, but I think we have to have a little bit confidence from implementation. So I think that would be something where I think we would want to wait for before going for working plus core.
So Jim from the Jabber says he has a full multicast implementation for OSCORE. So I guess, yeah, that's the group co-op part is there.
Yes.
To run group OSCORE.
Okay. The question is, does this cover all of what's in the draft right now? And that's maybe something we should ascertain before we actually go for GNU plus core. So that would be one of the reviews, looking at implementation status and see how confident we are. Yeah, but apart from that, I think this is good work. So anybody else who would argue for adoption of this document? Who thinks we should not adopt it? So in soccer, 1-0 is enough.
From Jabber +1, adopt, from Jim and Christian.
Okay. Okay, it seems this is not quite in-room consensus yet, but we can take the adoption call to the list, and this time we are not going to forget doing that for another 4 months. And go ahead with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So next is Samuel. As I said, we have 2 documents in the ISG right now, and we have 2 documents that are in various stages in the working group. And what we'll do is we'll look at all 4, but maybe we are going to look at units in the end, because the inventor of SNML and founding chair of this working group isn't here yet, Colin Jennings, and he has some interest in getting this fixed. So maybe we start with the other things.
Okay, so let's start with fetch and patch with SNML. So this draft is already in ISC review. It's currently stated that it needs a revised draft. There was no updated version for this IETF because I wanted to have all the updates in the from the ISC reviews in the same version, but you can find them in GitHub's pull requests, those latest changes. So there was very good IoT Directorate review from Matthias Kovac. Thanks a lot for that. A bunch of small fixes here and there, and a bunch of ISC comments from Warren, Barry, and Alyssa, and also ISC discuss from Roman that have been addressed already in the version in GitHub. One of the recurring comment we got from IESG was this fragment ID section was a bit confusing, so I did a rewrite for that, and also added some examples, and at least I haven't got any complaints on the new version so far. Also added a bunch of clarifications that what are really the mandatory parts you need in every fetch and patch. There needs to be at least one record. Each record needs to have at least a name, etc. Also, that co-op is used for securing these operations, because this format itself doesn't provide any security, but it's really the work of the underlying protocol. And also clarify that iPatch and patch are equivalent when it comes to ZenML patch, because the ZenML patch records are all idempotent. There are still one discuss from Adam and one comment from Ben that still needs to be addressed. And in particular, the review from Adam raised a few other issues that I'd like to get your group feedback and confirmation for. So one issue that we noticed is that we actually didn't have a selector with units. So how currently both fetch and patch work, that you always include a name of the record, and you may include a time to select the records either for fetching or for patching. And the reason for doing a design like that, only including a few fields there, is that then you can use these few fields for find the record and every other field for patching them. Like 90% of cases, you actually want to patch only the value, but there's usefulness for being able to also add new fields to the records. What we didn't actually pay attention to, that it already in the RFC examples, quite often unit is used to also disambiguate on records. So you may have same name for a source of data, but you, for example, say this is latitude, this is longitude, and only the unit tells you apart which record is the relevant for which part. So obviously we do need to also add unit to the list of selectors. So the proposal here is to update that and say, yes, you always have name, and you may have time and or unit. So basically that addition of unit is the change there. And it would be like so far, you would be an exact match. So whatever you have of this combination of the three needs to be present in the record you want to find for fetching or patching. So if you don't have any concerns of this way going forward, that's going to be part of also the next version of the draft.
Carsten Bormann from the floor. This means you never can update the unit in a record?
Correct.
Sounds reasonable.
Yes, yes. So the way we chose to form whole patch and fetch record has this downside that whatever is used as a selector cannot be used as a patcher. So you have to choose one way or the other. That's also, we got the question, so where do you draw the line? Well, this is where we want to draw the line. Get the very minimal set that you really need, the name, time, and unit to select uniquely records. If you do need something more elaborate, there you still have the JSON patch format, which has a lot of power, but also a lot of complexity. So you can still patch stuff, but then you have to pay the price. Then another thing that Adam pointed out, that we should probably clarify that the record order matters in the patching. So what may happen that you have multiple records that are operating on fields with similarity. So for example, if you have two records that both end up removing the same record in the target pack, that should be an error, but you don't really know until you actually handle the fact you are actually handling them both. So what Adam was suggesting as a solution that first of all, clarifying that if patch record matches more than one ZenML record, that's immediately an error. That's something we may want to consider, but that's more on the next slide. And if this if any of the patch records fails, then you don't change anything. So the whole patch needs to be atomic. And then you would apply all the records sequentially. I mean, this seems to me a very reasonable thing to clarify in the draft, that it need to be addressed sequentially. The only question there is, do we want to allow applying patch to more than one record? And that brings the last point. So currently the texts kind of implied that it's an error if you match more than one. That needs to be clarified anyway. Alternative design here would be that you can match multiple records with a single patch record, and you, for example, be able to delete multiple records. When this was first suggested to me, I think it was Klaus, I was like, hey, that's a good idea. I did a bit more thinking. I found a whole bunch of complexities there, corner cases. So it might be just simple to go for, okay, you don't want to do this. If you need to modify something, put a separate patch record for every single modification you want to do, and be done with it. So this is basically a request for you guys. If you have a use case in mind that you would think that matching multiple records for patching is a must, please let me know as soon as possible. Otherwise, I'm leaning towards it's an error if a patch record happens to match multiple. Just a simple thing to handle, and then you deal with it that by being more specific which record you need to apply to. Any immediate reactions on that?
Customer from the floor again. So, are we sure that this is all idempotent?
The deletions should be. I think we did the exercise once. We should probably double check, especially if you match more than. Let's double check.
Okay.
But yeah, that was the intention.
Yeah, it's very easy to mess up and do something where this important property gets lost.
Oh, you wanna? Yes. So which one's next? Actually, we have Colin now.
Yes, that's why I'm reloading the slides.
Okay, so you have the next one.
Yes, and the Chromebook is establishing a secure connection.
Okay, while we wait the slides to reload, I guess there was no violent agreement on the way forward I proposed, so I'll go along those lines, make a new version, submit that, and then if IESG is happy and we check the idempotency issue once more, I think that's going to be on its way for an RFC.
What are you doing?
You're going to do the more units?
No.
You want me to do it?
Yes. I just wrote the words, but.
Okay, so presenting on behalf of Karsten, his draft. I may have been also active contributor for this draft. So quick reminder about the CNML units registry. It's a short strings to represent units of measurements. So we're not defining units. I mean, there's other organizations who actually do that work. What we are defining here is that how do you express those in CNML? So M stands for meters, etc., and S for seconds. In the original CNML RFC, we had a rather restrictive registration policy. That was a long debate on that, and we wanted to lean towards facilitating interoperability, that we don't need to be doing a lot of conversions. So we wouldn't have kilometers or miles, we'll just have meters in the registry. However, what we did more and more notice after getting more deployment experience on CNML, that there are a lot of derived units in practical use today, and sometimes it can be tricky to actually use only the unscaled SI units. For example, in OMA SpecWorks, there's millisecond, kilowatt hours, dBMs, etc. So if in order for those models to use only the units we had originally in the CNML registry, they would have to change a large amount of existing models, which can be very impractical. And also, in many uses, there is a natural scaled offset or a unit that is used. For example, millisecond in some units of time, micrometers for particle size, even though we have meters for it, usually always measure micrometers, or kilowatt hours if you're doing power stuff. So a proposal that we had at the last IETF is to have this secondary registry of CNML units. So it would be another registry with slightly different kind of rules that would be accepting also the scaled units, but there would be mapping rules always to the original CNML units. And there's a few examples from kilometer and dBm on how that works in practice. So based on discussion before the last IETF with OMA SpecWorks, that seems to be a very good way forward. I would be addressing those use cases. And also, of course, this conversion thing, being able to do it automatically seems to be a very useful feature. And it seems that IANA is actually planning to have a JSON-based registry too sometime next year. So you could actually more facilitate of getting that information automatically and processing it part of your application. Then there was a long discussion on the email list something like a month ago that I think Colin initiated on that. And really, like, is this the right way to do things? And how do we still want to actually maintain the interoperability but still accommodate on some of the needs on the industry? So what the draft that Carson wrote currently says is that we're not recommending to use the secondary units. It's really the case that you really have to do it, and then basically use the first table if you can at all can. If you cannot, then here's a way you can still deal with ZenML. But of course, there were some concerns. Are we actually now creating two different kind of ZenMLs, and how do we deal with interoperability when there's going to be much more units than maybe a lot of implementations were expecting for? Anything else you want to say on this one?
Yeah, I think there are several facets to this. One is the editorial one to say may but should not. This sounds almost like an RFC 6919 keyword, but it's really not meant that way. And the other one is the way we are updating 8428 the right way by simply saying we are putting in that secondary registry. And of course, if you implement ZenML, you implement that secondary registry, but still its use is not recommended. So these are two different levels we could make more clear. So before we go into the full discussion, Ari has 2 more slides, I think. But if you have direct comment on this, please.
This is Colin Jennings. I mean, this won't change anything in what happens in the real world, right? Like whether we may not, you should, but we know you will, whatever, right? Like I'm not really, I think that we need to hit the core problem, and then maybe we'll come back and tune these words a little bit. But I just want to note one thing on the framing of this. This is not something new we discovered. We knew all of this information about units long before we set up the current registry and the current RFC. We discussed all of this extensively. So this, and I'm not saying we shouldn't reevaluate and change, and which I think is the proposal Ari has here, or both of you have. But I don't think it's like we suddenly discovered that people used milliseconds. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. And I also don't think and we have a trade-off between what will help us achieve interoperability of this data in where it's used, not just the focus of what would be convenient to generate. And we need to think about both of those as we go forward on this. Does that make sense?
Yes. So indeed, we have no new information on this side, and this wouldn't make us change anything. The new information we have is that other SDOs might be using the ZenML.
That was well known in the previous version of this argument and discussed when we made the previous decisions. Yes. That is not new information either. And so anyway, my recommendation on this slide is this isn't the right time to worry about the details of that. We should go figure out what our real solution looks like on this stuff and then come back to what advice. I mean, clearly, if we're making a table, it's because we intend people to use it. That's why we're making this whole thing. So let's not just be like, I mean, this will be about as useful as saying we recommend you use V6 and you shouldn't use V4. I mean, people are going to do what they're going to do. So I'm not really worried about these words very much.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing I think would make a lot of sense to do is, I mean, instead of just saying may but should not, like write down that rationale. That, I mean, a lot of that was actually documented in the email discussion that we had on the mailing list, like why using table 1 actually makes a lot of sense. And that there are a lot of non-obvious aspects there, putting those in the draft. So whenever an engineer comes across and, okay, which one should I use? At least you have some guidance of these non-obvious aspects, and then may, do an informed decision based on that. But then, yeah, we had a good discussion this morning with Colin and Karsten, starting at 7 a.m. That's how committed we are. So Based on that, I guess we kind of agreed. Yeah, we do want to do this accommodating for the more units. That's kind of where we agreed on. Well, we had in the end quite a bit of discussion. Okay, so how would we handle this registry with the new units? So we did discuss some proposed expert review guidance for now what we call Table 2, the more relaxed units. So probably it should be something. Okay, we need the units to be a subset of 7-bit ASCII basically, but only having alpha digits. So we're not looking forward the same style that we have for the current units. I'm probably using the same character set as the names to be more explicit on that. But then what kind of units should we accept? In the original registry is pretty much like unscaled SI, which is rather strict. There's a few exceptions there already, but that was kind of the general guideline. So for this would be kind of towards the other end of the spectrum, being much more liberal, but we do want to have still something that is not like any random proposal would be accepted. So one way to phrase this, what we're thinking would be that units that are found in existing scientific literature or specification, that you can point to a specification that uses this unit, whether it's some industry consortium or some ISO spec, then pretty much would be accepted. Of course, if there's the already same unit for that thing, so we shouldn't have two strings meaning the exact same thing. That wouldn't make much sense. But sometimes there are cases where actually really deep down it is the same thing, but there are two different industries that are using different quote-unquote unit to describe that. Then maybe it actually makes sense to have the same unit, different unit identifier for the same underlying SI unit. And also checking when there is a new registration. I mean, even though it would be kind of towards first come first served, you would check that, okay, if that someone wants to register cm for meaning something else than centimeter, probably we should advise them to go find another identifier for it. And also what we actually have right now is we have these two things for same SI unit, like reactive apparent power. We may want to move some of these things to the Table 2 that maybe were originally proposed for Table 1 though. And we should think about the naming syntax. One thing that was recently proposed was this events per hour per square meter. In the original guidance, we had like, okay, you shouldn't have more than one slash, forward slash in the units, but for that kind of unit, 2 forward slashes may make sense. So this was as an initial draft on like the guidance on the Table 2, because the current guidance in the draft was rather, maybe wasn't quite adequate and maybe even conflicting.
So Colin Jenkins, just to add a little bit more on this. I mean, this makes a very open registry. Just to provide some examples of intent, this makes very open registry. If somebody's asking for micro fortnights as a unit at a time, we'd probably give it to them, right? And definitely miles per hour and everything else for sure. And it's to try and give people what they want. And we have examples that are already in the draft, like the heartbeats per minute unit that, it's hard to justify some of these things, right? And that would be fine in this table. It would allow exactly those types of things. One other thing that I really want to highlight for people is this reactive apparent power. We have lots of things where people really want to use units for something that is not units at all, but tags additional semantic meaning to them. And I think this, the different types of power measurements are excellent examples of a good use of that, and we should allow that. But that opens the slippery slope. I think this will totally open also, in mini industry, parts per billion of carbon dioxide and parts per billion of oxygen, they consider those two different units. And that's no different than the power one. So I think we've got to be okay with that. And I think I can see many advantages of having the second type of registry that had that very open type of idea, particularly with the machine readable way of mapping it back to Table 1. So I just want people good with that type of openness to this table? I mean, I think that's one of the things that Ari and I are trying to get feedback on here.
Hi, I'm Matt Gilmore. I work with Itron. To your point, though, quite frankly, we do not. My company makes electric meters. We've shipped probably 200 million smart meters across the world. So I get it that you can represent kWh, and it's just a scalar unit of joules, but we will never ship joules over the air. It's kWh. So I mean, there's got to be some means where an industry has a standard, and we're just trying to bring it out to the IoT. And that's why we went to secondary registry.
I mean, I would say heard loud and clear, and you're not the first people to say exactly that, right? It's not the only example. We've had other people who, have said when they set a house temperature in Fahrenheit or Celsius, they're not converting it. They're setting it to what it's either 21.5 or 79 degrees, but it's not something else.
Mm-hmm. So I think we have a pretty good agreement that, okay, we will have more units. It's more on the details, like how do we organize the whole thing. And the expert review guidance is kind of one key part there. So all feedback here would be very much appreciated. And of course, anyone volunteering to be the expert, I mean, those are also highly appreciated. Someone, background on these kind of things, I think would be very good. Okay, there. One more slide, or you want to comment right on this one?
I'll let you finish.
Okay. The one issue we couldn't quite get agreement on, or we still need to do some more analysis on, is should we use the same U field, or should we have a new field for the units in the second table? And now that's called the U2 field. So in the first proposal where you're using the same unit for both, I mean, they both go in the same X and U field, there are some downsides to it. For example, that if you wrote software that is kind of expecting things in table 1, you may have assumed that this is rather stable registry. Of course, there will be new units, but not like in masses. So those assumptions might be broken once you get 100 new units in the table 2. Also, in some cases, it might be useful to have a clear indication on the wire, is this stuff from the table 1 or table 2. But that would actually then make the U2 proposal potential. On the other hand, having the separate field for these units from table 2, it does create, in particular in CNM, a lot of complexities with different fields for similar things. And that's what we hit when we were discussing the content type, string and numeric value. Okay, it's a simple thing. Let's make them separate fields because they're different values. No, you hit a lot of complexities, a lot of corner cases, how base values override each other, and you just bunch of complex logic, which you can easily avoid if you stick into the single field. And also, I mean, these are still units in the same sense, so that kind of semantics of that field are the same. What we did conclude in our morning workshop that, we need to do more analysis on things and think of the corner cases. Anyone interested in this and willing to chat a bit more, feedback would be highly welcome. We're planning to talk about a bit more during the week, and maybe we can have a quick one on the core session on Friday on our conclusions where we may land during this week and actually have a proposal for way forward. Right now, we don't have a clear one.
Yeah, having another side meeting on this is probably a good idea. You just proposed adding unit as a selector criteria in
Yes.
fetch. Are we adding U2 as well?
That will be part of those complexities we will hit if we
Yes.
get another field. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm not sure the U2 is the only way to skin this cat, but the thing that I feel very strongly about is we had these two opposite ends of the spectrum, so they have pros and cons, and the spectrum what we chose in Cinema now was very much in favor of what made it easy to do analytics and combine this data and use it in an interoperable way. And I don't think that we can just I think we need to find a backwards compatible way if we're going to change this. We can't just, we're too late to just change it. There's too much software written that assumes that if it's dealing with the units, it will understand them and be able to process it. So I'd like us to find some way that it's very clear whether we're using the new units or the old units. I don't believe that any amount of you should or should not use this or that. I mean, we just heard the answer to how that conversation is going to go, right? It doesn't, right? I think that we need to think about all the things that went with the assumption of our current RFC. We have to not break why they did that and what they're doing. And this would do it. There might be other ways to do it, but I think we need to find some way of not breaking that type of interoperability.
Yep. Yeah. Or at least minimize the damage. I guess that's one.
Fair enough. Yes.
Yeah. Because, I mean, of course, already today, technically, any implementation should expect there are going to be new units also in the first registry. But yes, the assumption on the amount of new units is quite different.
The assumption is if there won't be new units which their application inherently understands,
True.
but
Yes.
they can't read, right?
Exactly.
Like, yeah, sure, somebody might add radiation and they only do temperature, but they're going to be surprised to get Fahrenheits that their application should be able to process, which they can't.
Alexei, as your poor AD for this document, it looks like this one is not ready for ASG, basically.
Yeah, we do need to figure out this U2 thing. Hopefully, we'll get some clarity this week. So, yeah, as we discussed last time, there is some urgency on getting a registry and getting the values there. The U2 part may not be that urgent, because I mean, for that it's more, we could figure it out later. I don't know if there's a sensible way to do, let's say, pre-registration of the units, and then we'll figure out this detail later on, I mean, during the process. But having those units usable is kind of the urgent things. And I think there's no really disagreement on that we need those identifiers, and the identifiers themselves are rather straightforward. So then we wouldn't have to then rush getting this into RFC if we could have the registry ready.
Okay. Second question is, have you talked to Pete Resnick? He was the one who's continued discussion when Colin raised his...
Yeah, not after his emails, no. Should,
okay.
Yes.
Maybe you should talk to him. I think I might be incorrectly proxying his comments, but he thinks that one registry with an extra column saying whether it's recommended or not would be better. Less confusing to people. But again, you know, I personally sort of don't care, but some people feel strongly than others. I suggest you talk to him and see if it's a fair proxying of his comments or whether there is more to it.
Yeah, the main problem with that is that there are other columns. Almost all columns are different between table 1 and table 2.
I think it's a really administrative thing, and I agree with Karsten that like the separate tables makes sense from administrative point of view. But yeah, it's a good point. Let's check with Pete explicitly on that. At least he didn't react on the later comments where we were converging on this way of doing things. Like Colin was in the end favor of the two tables, and as everyone else.
I'm not trying to derail you all.
Yeah.
Difficultly achieved.
So Alexei just said he's not trying to derail our emerging consensus.
I was just going to say, and there's other things we found, like things that definitely need to be updated in the current draft with like the expert rule, like whatever rule 5 it was or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's definitely a very minimum, a rev of the draft is definitely needed. That's for sure. On the splitting and moving things forward, I'm not really very okay with that, because if we are going to use, I would rather not have these new units than have them in the U field with no solution to the problem posed here. So if we're going to add these new tables, there has to be some way of dealing with this problem. I'm not, So be very clear on that. I'm not okay with, if we know how we're going to do it, but it's not all finished yet, that's fine. I don't care. But we're not going to agree on the units before we agree whether we are breaking the whole design of the current CinML in a non-backwards compatible way, right?
So how about allowing table 2 in the U field if it's prefixed by an asterisk?
Prefixed by an asterisk. Okay, sure. I mean, like, look, as I said, there may be many ways to skin the cat, but that we agree on some way to skin this cat.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So
I hadn't thought of that, Karsten. Nice suggestion. So.
Yeah, I think we need to list those different options on a piece of paper or a screen and think about that once. I think we have many ways to solve this, and I'm sure we'll find a way. But I think, like, in order to make things move as fast as possible, I think, like, if we could, like, prepare for the pre-registration of these units, that it doesn't have to wait until there's an RFC mark on it. I think that would be very good for everyone depending on these new units. Because basically right now, since OMA, we kind of chose to use these units. We are blocking new registrations of objects before we get these units ready. So there is some urgency in that sense. Otherwise, we'll need to find a way around it, and that could just get messy in the end. So it would be much more clear to have the units in a registry, and then we figure out how we actually deal with that. Good. I think that was my last slide on that topic. Then the next one.
Almost in time.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Data value content format indication. So just a quick reminder what this draft is about. It's about giving content format information about the things that you would in CNML include in your VD, this data value field. So, for example, the example on the top, that's on putting CBOR array in a CNML data. And the second one would be putting basically comma-separated values run through gzip for compression in the data value. The changes what we had done since the last IETF, what we agreed over there, is that we are now using the same field and string values for both the content format and content type encoding. So we used to have different field for the string type and the integer type. That resulted in all the complications that I referred to earlier. So now we're just using string. Even though there's a numeric value, you put it in a string because it's just simpler, and there's a byte or two of overhead, but that seems to be well worth it. Also, we added this mandatory to understand version of the CT, so basically the CT underscore or base CT underscore. And we also added a bunch of examples. That's what Alexei was asking for, to actually kind of validate does this way that we form the string versions make sense. So there you can now see a few examples that are listed in the current draft. I think in particular the last one and the second to last one, where there's also the content coding included, are the interesting ones. So we're using now this new format of having the content coding separated by @ as part of the string. That allows us to use a single field for all of this piece of information and avoiding some of the complexities with multiple fields. However, there's still the same complication that we briefly discussed last time. How do you handle mixing base fields and mandatory to understand fields? What is really the field that ends up being used after you have resolved the records? And it's in particular take case number one that is a tricky, that you would have a base value for foo that you say is mandatory to implement and understand, and later on you would have a foo that is not mandatory. What actually ends up being applied and how? So currently, so this is nothing specific to this draft. It's a CNML feature at large, but this is the first draft where we actually hit this issue. So current text says that, okay, the mandatory to understand field overrides the regular field, and you shouldn't be mixing them. And shouldn't be mixing them. Actually, is a very sensible thing overall, but you may not be able to avoid that if you're combining CNML from multiple sources. So one source uses the mandatory to understand, the other one uses the regular fields. You want to put them in the same pack. How do you deal with it? We thought we had a resolution on it, then we realized it's actually more complicated than you think. So RC 1925 Rule 8 applies also here. So we're planning to have one more closer look on these rules. How does it actually should be resolved? Again, feedback would be very welcome. We'll probably need to write maybe a BIS of CNML someday, include some instructions there, or put it somewhere in a generic fashion, some guidance how to do this. But this is the first draft. We actually have to solve that issue specifically. Okay, any questions, comments on that one? Shall we move on? Okay, and Alexei, if you can in particular have a look at the format and see if that's sensible, kind of from media type expert AD point of view. You can look at the examples in the draft and see if it actually works for you. Okay, then we're actually on time. The final CNML draft, the base prefix. So this is a draft I wrote together with Christian Amsus. The idea there is that in CNML we have this requirement for globally unique names. For example, in the RFC we commonly use IPv6 prefix in the prefix of the name in order to get these globally unique names. And the whole idea there is that with globally unique names, they facilitate information exchange across multiple systems because you have a globally unique identifier you can always point to regardless of the source where you actually got the information from. The downside of this choice is that you sometimes have a long, and this is long in quotes because I mean depends where you measure to, long names can end up some tens of bytes of overhead for a pack. And so if you are in a very constrained network, something like LoRaWAN perhaps, it actually may make a big difference for you and you want to really squeeze out the remaining bytes. The thing is, like usually the base name prefix has some information that is also available out of band of the CNML pack. For example, an IP address, a request URI, perhaps TLS identity, etc. So the proposal in this draft is that you would be able to indicate how should you construct the base name based on the information that is available out of band. And then when this information is no longer available, for example, after the first hop, you would then replace this pointer with the information that you are using, and therefore be able to use again like standard RFC CNML. There is an IPR declaration on this draft, the number 3662. You can go and check it out for more details. How it looks like in practice, here you have the IPv6 address as the base name. You basically replace that with a new field called BPI and say they're number one referring to IPv6 address as the pointer, and then send it forward. And then when you would actually send it then forward further on, you would then be using the one format, the upper format, which is then again standard CNML. Then of course the question is like, what kind of values can you use for BPI? Here's our current proposal. So we could use the IP address as in the previous example, potentially with the port. Also, what seems to be a rather common thing is use the request base URI. So depending where you did the request on, that could be used to form the globally unique base name. Also, if you have security association on your connection, you're using TLS or something similar, you could use, for example, your public key or the fingerprint of the public key. There's a nicely defined format in RFC 6920 on how you could do that. Or you could use, for example, PSK identity. Or if you're using core resource directory, your endpoint identifier are often already usable for this purpose. So you just say, okay, you use my endpoint identifier as the base name prefix, and you're done. So the current status of this work, Hannes Chovanec actually presented at the last IETF another draft, was addressing the same problem. This problem was originally discovered in the OMA OMA work related to lightweight M2M, because they were actually using something like this, but not being explicit about it. So basically, in a lot of the cases, you only send the path component and not actually the prefix component as we generally have in SendML. So what this method would be doing is just making that information explicit, so then you can use things from the OMA lightweight M2M ecosystem and things from outside in an interoperable fashion. The key difference compared to the Hannes' proposal was that there it was a new field instead of base name. It was this relaxed rules base name or local base name that relaxes the rules for uniqueness. Different approaches for the same case. However, as Hannes pointed out on the mailing list, it seems that at least within the OMA sphere, the stuff seems to be interoperable even without this addition. So we should have a closer look, like in what kind of cases would we actually need this. I think it's going to be mostly valuable when you do go outside of a, let's say, for example, lightweight M2M ecosystem, and you actually need to exchange information in SendML format outside of ecosystems, but you still want to have this good compression inside the ecosystem. But we'll be looking into more details on that and reporting in the upcoming IETF meetings.
Okay. Yeah. So what do we do with this draft?
So as I said, we'll have a closer look, and I think we'll know at the next IETF. Unfortunately, I was a bit of a longer vacation before this IETF, didn't have time to do that analysis. So we'll have a closer look and see what direction makes sense. I mean, should we potentially combine the mechanism that Hannes proposed, or is this one way or better or the other? I think, like from author's point of view, closer look is needed. So consider this as more as a heads up and intro to the problem and potential solutions.
Okay. I think in that case, we are done for today.
Wow.
See you all on Friday.
Have we ever ended early?
Yes. Well, this is my 29th core working group meeting, and I think we did once before.
Okay. Wow. Cool. Thank you.
So just for information, this room will be used for a lunch meeting. Oh, who has the blue sheets? Is there still one blue sheet floating? So this room will be used for a lunch meeting, so please do leave it at 12. Thank you. That's true, yes.